Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSat network. Our topic of discussion today is different perspectives to study Indian political thought, and for this very discussion and lecture we have with us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. And with this introduction I welcome sir and request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming sir.
Thank you, Urvashi. In fact, today's discussion on Indian political thought, particularly different perspectives or different approaches to access the whole ideas which are available to us in name of political thought. We'd like to divide this discussion into 3-4 different perspectives under which people have tried to interpret it over the years. Now, these 3-4 perspectives, which are quite popular in both social science and otherwise also, are known as classical, the Islamic or syncretic. Sometimes Islamic and the syncretic are basically separated, because syncretism was a kind of trend within the Islamic thought, but there are other strands also. So, I mean, one can say that the medieval syncretic thought, and the third is this modern, which is normally split into 4-5 different perspectives like liberal, Marxist, Gandhian, post-colonial, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, these are some of the important perspectives through which people have tried to look at Indian political thought. When we talk of Indian political thought, then in fact, in terms of the time span, it is spread over 3 different periods in history, that is ancient, medieval, and the modern. Now, the 3 different periods in history in fact have produced different type of priorities in terms of political thinking, but nonetheless there are certain foundational principles through which one can access the whole corpus of ideas which are known as political thought in India. Now, before we come to those foundational principles, and then we will like that how these different approaches can be understood, we should also remember certain facts regarding Indian political thought which would help us in this enterprise. Now, for the first thing which is important here is to remember that for number of years Indian political thought was not accorded the status of thought, and it was simply considered as an identity question, or a kind of articulation of certain concerns which were driven by the urge of identity. So, I mean, initially people were quite dismissive of Indian political thought, that in fact when you talk of political thought, it is basically a privilege which is only reserved for the Western people, and Indians did not have the proper way of reflecting, imagining things for the future, because one of the important aspect of political thought is building utopia, that is imagining the future, and it was believed that Indian political thought did not have the capability to imagine the future the way it should be done with the help of certain tools and techniques which the thinkers deploy in this exercise. Therefore, this utopia building exercise was not available. Secondly, it was believed that the Indian political thought was mostly experience centric, and therefore it did not have the component of logic, and because it was devoid of this logical component and only was based on the experiences, and therefore it was empirical in nature, and hence it cannot be accorded this status of thought. The third thing which was also often cited was that Indian political thought was basically intricately associated with the ideas, the religious ideas, the scriptures, religious scriptures, and therefore it was an extension of theology, and therefore it cannot be accorded the same status which we accord to the Western political thought. Similarly, it was also argued that the Indian political thought was devoid of certain considerations, or devoid of a kind of understanding or the quest for truth and knowledge, and therefore, what was put before us in form of thinking of any period in Indian history was not related to the idea of truth or the idea of reality, but it mostly pertained to the question of certain social structures or hierarchies, and therefore, it was basically a status quoist in nature, and hence it was not suitable for consideration for this political thought. So, these were some of the arguments on basis of which it was dismissed. But what happened later, that as a result of India's encounter with the West, particularly during colonial period, a new engagement basically ensued, and that engagement resulted into two different types of tendencies, or three different types of development, and one of them was the development which basically influenced the whole corpus of, whole host of people who started trying to present Indian political thought in a better light, and were starting they started simply telling the West that what existed in West also existed in India, and therefore, they tried to match the West with the Eastern ideas and Eastern thought, particularly Indian political thought. And this trend has been dubbed by some of the experts on Indian political thought as imitative or derivative, that it was highly a derivative discourse. And one of the scholars working on modern Indian political thought, Partha Chatterjee, he calls modern Indian political thinking as derivative discourse, because it was imitative in nature, it was simply trying to imitate the ideas of the West. Now, in reaction or as a result of this encounter, the other trend also developed, and this trend tried to romanticize the past, romanticization of the past, and they tried to show that what happened in the West not only happened in ancient times, but rather they were better than the West. Now, on the one hand, the derivative imitative wanted to imitate the West and try to offer a kind of critical analysis of both traditional and the modern, and try to create a new framework for understanding society. But on the other hand, the attempt was to romanticize the past, and romanticizing in such a way that it was argued that whatever is available in the West was available in India also, and therefore, wherever a critique was required, it was simply ignored, and whatever idea existed in ancient time, medieval times, or even in modern times was endorsed uncritically. So, romanticization. But of course, along with these two trends, there was also a critical evaluation of Indian political thought, and it is because of this critical evaluation that we have seen that now really very significant growth, both in terms of the interpretation as well as study of Indian political thought has developed over the years. And therefore, today Indian political thought is placed in a much better and much much comfortable position than what it was earlier. And as a result of this, we find that it is being studied in most of the Indian universities, as well as it is also now taken seriously in the Western academia. So, with this background, we have to see that how these four different perspectives have tried to interpret Indian political thought. Now, these four perspectives, as I mentioned, the classical and this syncretic, and the third is basically the contemporary, and the contemporary is basically can be seen in terms of liberal, Marxist, Gandhian, post-colonial, and so on and so forth. So, these four different types of approaches one can see that over the years are available to us as perspectives on Indian political thought. Now, to begin with, this classical perspective. Now, this classical perspective, as the name suggests, pertains to those ancient periods or those ancient texts and scriptures through which certain ideas have emerged about both social and political reality. Now, this classical interpretation of Indian political thought is of course mostly textual, that the study and the analysis is based on the text available in India. Of course, those texts are the texts which are religious in nature. Some of the texts are religious in nature, for example, the Puranas. But at the same time, there are other texts also, I mean Upanishad, or for example, there are many texts which are the discourses on law, the discourses on ethics, and so on and so forth. So, basically the classical approach simply tries to base the entire thing on basis of those important texts, that how with the help of those texts Indian society can be understood and Indian society can be accessed, Indian mind can be accessed, how one can understand the thinking in India, that how it materialized in ancient time, and how those texts can be important source to understand it. Now, there are many philosophers in the West now who are basically turning to those texts, because those texts have been matter of two different types of interpretations. There are people who have tried to, there are scholars who have tried to look at those texts with the help of the lens provided by the Western Western academia or the Western minds, and therefore in the phase of this Orientalist spell during colonial period, when the colonial state tried to promote understanding of Indian tradition, Indian culture with the help of those texts, and particularly it was quite prominent during time of Warren Hastings, as it is known to all of us. And subsequently this Orientalist and the Anglicist conflict which materialized here, but the Orientalists initially got the state patronage, and they tried to basically use those texts to develop an understanding about Indian society. And for example, some of the great Orientalist scholars in India, William Jones, Max Muller, and so on and so forth, I mean they belong to that generation. But one thing is to we should remember here, that this Orientalist approach was largely based on a particular way of dealing with these texts, and this was based on the interpretation given by the Pandits and the Mullahs, I mean the traditional elites, or the knowledge seekers, or those who considered themselves as the custodian of these texts, and therefore this entire Orientalist perception was colored by this type of perspective. Now, recently we have seen that there has been a significant growth in terms of its refinement, and now it has been further refined, and now it is not simply based on the interpretation of the Pandits and the Mullahs, but the modern tools and techniques of interpretation are deployed to see that how those texts can provide us some clue to understand Indian society, Indian polity, and so on and so forth. Therefore, some of the principles through which the Western political discourse have been structured or have been understood, those tools and techniques are also those concerns are also basically put in the forefront while interpreting these texts in India. Concerns like concern for truth and knowledge, concern for power, authority, and legitimacy, concern for emancipation and freedom, concern for equality and justice, and it is attempted that to see in those texts that how these concerns can be seen, or should we or can we find some basis for our contemporary understanding of our social and political reality, and with the help of the ideas available in these texts. So, I mean this way we can see this refinement of tools and techniques, but nonetheless this classical approach when we talk of basically pertains to in fact this old generation, the earlier generation, and this was primarily Orientalist in nature. Orientalist, when I say, then I basically mean that the kind of Orientalist exercise which was undertaken by the colonial state and so on and so forth. We will come to this issue later, that how this Orientalist perspective had certain priorities in mind, how they structured the entire thing with help of certain principles, and they try to explain social and political reality with the help of those principles. But before I do that, I would also like to mention here that this the advent of this new this beginning of this new interest in this textual analysis can be seen in context of two developments. Of course, this classical, the distortions in the classical approach, or trying to rectify the imbalance which one found in the classical perspective, that consideration is there, but at the same time it is also basically tried to it is also attempted that how this modern techniques can be used to access some of the ideas, some of the knowledge system of the past in India, and we can simply, instead of being dismissive of those things in name of rationalism, science and modernity, we should basically give some autonomy to those ideas, instead of looking for coherence, because coherence cannot be a criteria to just these ideas coming from tradition, because the traditional ideas lacked coherence. So, in simply simply in order to find coherence, and if we do not find coherence in those ideas, then we become dismissive to them. I mean, instead of doing that, it is suggested that we should give some autonomy to those ideas, and we should try to see that how in this kind of anarchic or disorderly corpus of ideas do we have some clues to understand certain aspects of Indian society and politics, that do we have any linkage between those ideas and this reality, because always we find that every geographical region has had a particular system of ideas, and nothing relativist, nothing localism, nothing kind of essentialism that it is totally different from the other part, but nonetheless I mean certain ideas developed here, and how they developed and what was the relationship between those ideas and the social system or the social structure or the structure of political thought or the kind of reality which emerged here. So, this relationship is important, and therefore, instead of looking for coherence, instead of looking for the element of science as we understand it in context of the modern West, we should simply try to judge those ideas available in those texts in autonomous fashion and see that can they become the source of our knowledge system for the for this society. So, I mean this is a new sensitivity which has emerged, but nonetheless when we talk of the classical, then essentially we basically mean that the classical was a kind of perspective in Indian political thought which tried to look at the entire social and political organization, or they looked at the entire ideas which were available in society. They tried to look at the entire system, whether social, political or any other system, with the help of certain principles, and those principles we can put it in form of 3-4 different hierarchies, because hierarchy they considered a very significant aspect of the Indian social thought, Indian social reality, social and political reality. So, to some extent they constructed an ideal type, and ideal was order and change, that Indian society was based on the principle of order, that there was order behind this structure, and there was also a principle of change, and change informed by something integral to it, rather change coming from the outside. So, I mean this order and change were the part of this discourse, and therefore the classical thought tried to see that how this order and change were taking place, how order and change were related to each other, how this order and change could be perceived and understood with the help of the texts available in Indian tradition, whether it is in the Shastras or Purans or Upanishads or some of the basically or the Vedas. So, I mean this way they try to look at this entire thing, the idea of order and change. Now, what they believe that there are certain principles which are basically integral to this entire design, and those principles through which one can understand this entire evolution of Indian society, Indian culture, Indian tradition and Indian mind. And those principles they believe are number 1 hierarchy, and the number 2 holism. And this holism is basically something very significant, that it entire thing was considered as whole, and therefore, this relationship between different parts in the whole, I mean was one important dimension of this entire thing. So, therefore, the classical perspective on Indian political thought would try to interpret this issue of hierarchy, holism, continuity and change, and therefore, basically continuity and change, that there is a continuity, there is uninterrupted continuity, but thereby also they would say that there is a space and the scope for change within it. So, I mean these three things, hierarchy, holism, continuity and change, and they would say that these are the three important principles which have informed this entire Indian discourse over the ages, and Indian political thought therefore has been influenced and colored by these three important principles. When they talk of hierarchy, basically they talk of 3-4 different types of hierarchies, and they say that these 3-4 hierarchies are the foundational hierarchies or the foundational structures on basis of which the Indian society functions and works. For example, they would say that the first hierarchy is the hierarchy of Varna, and that is the role institutionalization, that entire society has been visualized as divided into 4 different Varnas, and in fact, the Varna and the caste of course is the byproduct of the Varna, and a lot of people feel that caste is in fact is the the distortion of this Varna principle, because Varna principle was a role institutionalization, that certain roles were visualized for every individual in the society, and those roles were defined with the help of this hierarchical understanding of social order. So, I mean those 4 Varnas, as it is well known that Brahman, Kshatriya, Shudra and Vaishya, the 4 Varnas, and these Varnas were not by birth initially as it is argued, but they were based on their duties or the roles which every individual was supposed to perform, but only later it became hereditary, birth based, and further distortions took place, and the caste and so many other things emerged out of it. But nonetheless, this classical perspective would look at this Indian society with the help of this important hierarchy of Varna, and they would say that this is how Indian thought basically imagined a more stable and orderly social order, and also imagined that the change would be possible within it only by following this basically dictates of these hierarchies. The second important hierarchy which is basically here mentioned is the hierarchy of Purusharth, and it is called goal orientation, the 4 different goals of individual in society. Now, these 4 goals Purusharth are important to remember, and here it is called Kam, Arth, Dharma and Moksha, the 4 important principles of Purusharth, that these goals in the life, the most important the goal is of course the dharma, and that is why in prioritizing those principles, I think dharma would come before other things. Then you have basically earth is basically the material pursuits. Then you have this sakam, and that is basically the sexual pursuits, and the 4th is the moksha, that is emancipation or basically salvation, and one can say that this moksha was the most important goal. But dharma and moksha were basically privileged over the kam and the earth, and therefore these 4 different types of goals within the Purusharth were very significant for creating a balance in social order, that how individual pursuits in life should be influenced by these 4 considerations, the 4 goals, and creating a harmony among these 4 goals and prioritizing those higher goals over the lower goals, that freedom in Indian context can be understood. And therefore, it is argued with the help of this classical perspective that Indian discourse of freedom was different from the discourse of freedom which materialized in the West, because the Western discourse of freedom, it is argued, was based on the split of the personality, or basically division of the body and mind. And this duality, the Cartesian duality as it is argued in the West, Indian discourse tried to overcome this duality, and therefore try to integrate the multi-dimensional character of human body, human mind, and therefore this goal attainment was considered to be very important. 4 different goals, and creating a balance in these 4 goals, and not only creating balance among these 4 goals, but creating a kind of harmonious relationship between the 2 hierarchies, the Varna and the Purusharth. And then the next goal, next hierarchy, which is basically posited here, and that is also quite significant, that is the hierarchy of ashram, the division of life, the 4-fold division of life. And here the 4-fold division of life is the brahmacharya, grihastha, vanaprastha and sannyas, the 4-fold division through which individual life cycle moves. So therefore, these 4 divisions of life in terms of brahmacharya, grihastha, vanaprastha and sannyas, and then the 4-fold the goal attainment, and then 4-fold as we mentioned the kind of role institutionalization. So 3 hierarchies become very important, interdependence among 3 hierarchies, the harmony which is created among 3 hierarchies. And along with these 3 hierarchies, there is also a 4th hierarchy, and hierarchy of time, and that is also important, because it is only with the help of this notion of time that the entire notion of continuity and change is understood and visualized. Now, this notion of time is seen with the help of 3-4 divisions of time, I mean historical time, and therefore those divisions of time are based on Kali Yuga, Dwapar, Treta and Satyuga, I mean the 4 division of time, that one followed by another, and therefore it is a cyclical instead of linear as it is normally available in the West, the notion of time. So, this cyclical notion of time in terms of these 4 hierarchies, and then you have a kind of interdependence between these 3-4 hierarchies. Now, is something very significant here to see that how this classical perspective tries to look at Indian political thought with the with the help of these 4 hierarchies, because I mentioned in the very beginning that hierarchy along with holism is very significant to understand this. And along with this hierarchy, this holism, that there is a notion of wholeness, and these 4 hierarchies complete this entire cycle. So, things are not seen in isolation, things are not split into parts, but they are basically serviced in such a manner that this whole is preserved and the whole is served. So, this hierarchy holism, and then continuity and change. Now, order and change, or the continuity and change, is another important dimension of this classical political thought, that it is not that the change doesn't take place, change occurs, but change occurs within the system or through the principles mentioned, institutionalized and prescribed in the system, rather the change coming from the outside. So, therefore, the change is taking place with reference to this hierarchy. So, therefore, there is a space for change. So, this argument that it was unchanging society, as the allegation which came later, and we will see it later when we will discuss this contemporary perspectives, particularly one of the reason that when Karl Marx was writing on India in 1850s in New York Daily Tribunes, he also argued that Indian society was stagnant, and therefore he looked at this colonial rule as something positive. Of course, he said that colonialism had come here for exploitative purpose, and that purpose will definitely be there, but nonetheless we should not deny that it will also herald new changes, and those changes will basically pave the way for transformation of society, because it was a stagnant society. But this classical approach would argue that it is not true, because the possibility and the space for change was already there. So, therefore, their argument would be based on the principle of change as basically prescribed or enshrined in this system based on these hierarchies. So, this is how this classical to put to briefly put the entire thing, this classical perspective has tried to look at the Indian political thought. Of course, this generation or this this genre of thinking like basing the entire understanding on text is not new. In fact, many Western scholars have also followed it. Some of the Indian minds, some of the Indian scholars have also used it. In fact, in 50s and 60s, the French sociologist Louis Dumont, when he wrote a book Homo Hierarchicus, I think he used this textual notion of Indian society to great benefit. For example, Dumont structured his entire discourse on the principle of the hierarchy and holism, and also argued that this junction between status and power, and that was perhaps the key principle of Indian social structure, and this principle was crucial to the Indian society for understanding the society, and therefore, any Indian thought which materialized here basically followed that principle of that disjunction between status and power, that is the material power and the spiritual power. And he particularly mentioned the kind of roles which were prescribed for Kshatriyas and the Brahmins, one as a king, another as a spiritual head, and therefore he said that this disjunction was central to this discourse. So, I think there have been many such studies over the years, but nonetheless what one finds that this classical perspective basically tries to look at the entire thing with help of these 3-4 hierarchies, and therefore they will argue that hierarchy, holism, continuity and change, these are the 3 important features which tell us that how Indian society works, how it functions, and how it has basically worked over the ages. So, in order to interpret Indian political thought, one has to take into account these factors, then only one will be able to understand both the thought and the practice. Now, the second perspective is the syncretic. Now, the syncretic, of course, perspective which has tried to look at this multicultural, multi-traditional evolution of Indian thinking, and it is here the 2 traditions are specifically mentioned. In fact, one is this Sufi tradition mostly coming from the Islam, and the second is the Bhakti tradition coming from the Hinduism, that how they try to provide a syncretic thought, as thought in which different cultures, different faith, different ideas intermixed with each other and created a harmonious and social fabric. And therefore, they would believe that it is not only scholars believe that it was not only at the level of the practice, but even at the level of governance, and often 2 emperors are cited here, one the Buddhist king Ashok, and the second the Mughal king Akbar, that how they tried to institutionalize a syncretic political order. For example, one of the economists who has worked on Indian political thought recently, Amartya Sen, he basically uses these 2 icons from Indian plethora of ideas, and uses these 2 icons from India, one from the ancient, another from medieval, to convey that how this syncretism is integral to Indian political thinking. It is basically not only harmonious, but it is also tolerance. So, tolerance is very important feature of this discourse, and therefore, they would argue that this syncretic thing emerged out of people's life. Basically, it emerged of the everyday experience, and therefore, this syncretic perspective, it is argued, is important aspect for Indian political thought. As we all know that in medieval times, these two movements, the Sufi movement and the Bhakti movement, spread in different parts of India. The traces of these two traditions are still around, but basically what happened during that time, that it was a kind of the protest movement against certain practices through which an attempt was made to present the entire thing in a more homogeneous and more monolithic form, and therefore, these two protest movements tried to present both culture, tradition, faith in a different light, saying that of course, there is Almighty, but this priestly mediation is uncalled for, and therefore, people's actions and people's basically association with the Almighty can materialize even without the help of any mediation. Now, we have seen this impact of these two movements in both art, in music, in culture, and even in political ideas. For example, subsequently we have seen that the entire policy of tolerance, which is basically presented today in form of secularism, at times refers to this syncretic culture of India, the syncretism as important hallmark of Indian culture and Indian tradition. But Jawaharlal Nehru, when he wrote Discovery of India, he made a special mention of these two movements. He made a special mention of these two thoughts, the Sufism and the Bhakti, and tried to say that how Indian society is more comfortable with such ideas, which is tolerant, which is syncretic, which is harmonious, which is based on the interdependence and intercultural dialogue and harmony. So, dialogue is very important, that it is argued that this Indian tradition, Indian culture, Indian society have functioned on the principle of dialogue and negotiation. And Amartya Sen, when he talks of the modern democratic possibility emerging from India, he believes that Indian society from the very beginning has privileged negotiation and dialogue among people, negotiation and dialogue among different faith, even different cultures, and perhaps this is one basis on, this is the basis of India's modern democracy, and therefore, he feels that India, in spite of illiteracy and poverty, succeeded in its democratic journey largely because of this traditional resource of dialogue and negotiation, the tolerance and harmony, and therefore, he believes this syncretism is integral to India. It not only can be seen in context of Sufism and the Bhakti, but it can be seen in context of the ancient philosophical traditions, whether it was Nyaya or some other schools of thought in ancient times. So, I mean this is the second way, the syncretic approach. The third is the contemporary theories to look at the Indian political thought, and these contemporary theories are threefold. The most important is the first important is the liberal approach, and the liberal approach, as it is well known that liberalism as it has emerged in the West in 16th and 17th century, in fact the ideas which are central to liberalism are autonomy of individual, the freedom of individual, the basically the individual volition, and then the rationality, reason. So, all these things individual at the center of the discourse, all these features which are basically used by this liberal approach to see that how Indian society can stand on these principles, and liberalism as it is argued that after this renaissance and reformation which started in India, unlike West when they were separated by more than 100 years, India reformation and renaissance both happened simultaneously. This is called Bengal Renaissance. I mean Ram Mohan Roy, the Brahmo Samaj, and then subsequently many such attempts, the Young Bengal movement of Derrizio, and then it spread to the Maharashtra, and then you had the Prarthana Samaj, the Rana Day, and then you had this Jyotiba Phule, and this reformist streak in Indian political thought continued even in 20th century up till Dalit Bahujan discourse, which picked up in the 20th century, initially with Phule and later on with Ambedkar. So, I mean, this is something which is very significant here, that the liberal perspective tries to see that how Indian political thought has been deficient on matter of individual freedom, on matter of region, and therefore, they try to create a new dialogue between the modern West and the India. And this thing has started with Ram Mohan, and therefore, he is called the father of modern India, because as it is well known, 1835 the famous Macaulay's Minutes, through which the modern English education was introduced in India. Before that, Ram Mohan had written a letter to Lord Amherst arguing for that education, and his famous word that with this, the books of Sanskrit and the Persians which are available in our library, neither good of mind can happen nor the good of society, and therefore, he argued for English education, and hence in fact, he is remembered as father of maker of modern India or father of modern India, because the modernity is supposed to have started in India only with the advent of modern education, at least the colonial modernity. So, I mean, this is how this liberalism would like to analyze and explain Indian political thought with reference to autonomy of individual's freedom, basically the status of individual in the entire thing. Now, it is believed that Indian political thought is society centric, group centric, not individual centric. Individual is at the margin of this discourse, because what has happened that the individual is in Indian discourse, it is argued that the individual's identity gets submerged in the identity of the group, whether it is a family or the caste or religion or so on and so forth. And therefore, the liberalism would say that from the point of view of individual and individual freedom, Indian political thought does not have much to offer, and therefore, they wanted to basically instill this kind of new sensitivity towards individual autonomy and individual freedom. And this Bengal Renaissance or the kind of reformation which started with Ram Mohan and others basically were essentially directed toward these things. But apart from that, the other concerns of liberalism is justice and equality. As it is well known, it was believed that this liberal discourse attributed the loss of freedom during the colonial period less to the colonial rulers and more to the Indian people, and they argued that Indians themselves were responsible for the loss of their freedom. For example, they often argued that instead of asking for freedom from the colonial state, they should first ensure that their own brothers and sisters get freedom and equality in India. Therefore, they often felt that gender and caste were written or were the markers of basically degradation of Indian civilization, which were used by the colonial rulers to subjugate Indian people. And therefore, these two issues were at the central, these two issues were central to this reformist politics, whether it was Ram Mohan or for that matter Vidyasagar or for that matter Ranade. So, this liberal tradition has been an important tradition, and it continued even later with after the attainment of freedom and the constitution was written, some of the liberal ideas, liberal values found place in the constitution, and therefore, Indian democracy started with this commitment, with this pledge that it would ensure that people enjoy all these values which are integral to modern times or modern civilization. So, liberal approach therefore has been critical of Indian tradition, Indian culture. They would not go by this textual reading of Indian thought or textual reading of Indian society. They would rather like to see the practices. For example, the classical approach would see that hierarchies are basically value neutral, or those hierarchies are basis on these hierarchies are the foundation on basis of which the entire society has worked so effectively over the ages. But the liberal would say that these hierarchies are hegemonic, these hierarchies are exploitative and inegalitarian. This hierarchy has led to degradation of both the women as well as certain sections of society in name of caste, and therefore, they would subject these hierarchies to critical scrutiny, unlike the classical perspective, which would simply use it as ideal type to see and understand Indian society. Now, after this liberal, the next perspective one can say is the Marxist perspective, and the Marxist perspective of course is also a modern perspective, and this Marxist perspective one can say that started with the writings of Karl Marx on India, 1850s, when Marx was writing for New York Daily Tribunes, and the series of writings which he produced for the newspaper, and in those newspaper writings he tried to study Indian society. And as I mentioned earlier, that he predicted that British rule in India would have a kind of a mixed baggage. It will produce both negative as well as positive fallouts in India. The negative, of course, he said that it essentially has gone there for exploitative purposes, and they would continue with that mission. But positive, on positive side, he argued that it will also lead to some major changes in Indian society, and specifically he singled out the railway system. He said the railways which were being introduced around that time, he mentioned that railways system would lead to the breaking of the backbone of India, the stagnation, that was a caste system, when different caste groups will intermix, travel together in the train, and therefore the practices of untouchability and segregation would end, and therefore it will pave the way for social change. But at the same time he also lauded the role of the colonial rulers in terms of the economic initiatives in the domain of economic development, and therefore he believed that basically colonial rule in India had a mixed baggage, negative as well as positive. But subsequently what we have seen, the whole host of Marxist scholars over the years have tried to use the tools and techniques of Marxism to study Indian society, Indian politics, and thereby they try to interpret Indian political thought. Now, what has happened, that their take is largely based on the tool of mode of production, which is central to this Marxist discourse, that how society has been structured. Initially they argued that India didn't have the normal development, therefore they would often cite Karl Marx's writing of 1850s, when Marx talked of Asiatic mode of production, and he said that entire world can be understood, at least the West can be understood with the help of class and the modern categories. But when it comes to East countries like India, in fact the class and other categories will be ineffective, because they have a different type of system, and that system was characterized as Asiatic mode of production. Asiatic mode of production, that autonomous village republics at the bottom and a autocratic state at the top, and they are basically linked with each other only with one important function, that is distribution and allocation of water. So I mean there is a debate on this. Subsequent, of course, Marxist historians modified this position, and a very interesting debate on the transition from took place in India, which has become famous as feudalism debate, and attempts were made by some Marxist historian like R.S. Sharma and others, before that Koshambi, to establish that India also had a normal development like West, and therefore the tools and techniques of Marxism as they are deployed to understand Western thought and Western society, those tools and techniques can also be deployed in India, and therefore that debate has led to a new understanding of Indian society and Indian thought. But apart from that, in fact what has happened, that this Marxist approach uses the class, but has not been able to come to terms with the phenomenon of caste, and therefore that has also influenced their political action to a great extent. They have also not been able to understand the impact and the influence, the hold of religion and culture on Indian people, and therefore one can see that the Marxist approach has not been able to make a major breakthrough in terms of their understanding of Indian thought, largely because they are still because they have been trying to look at the Indian political thought with the lens of the Western categories, and therefore since they have been looking through the prism of the West, that is why they have not been able to analyze many things. For example, they are totally dismissive of Indian thought because of close association between Indian philosophy and religion here, particularly Hinduism, but nonetheless they should also be careful in seeing the finer distinctions between religion and philosophy, that there are certain aspects of philosophy which may be integrated with religion, but nonetheless they have tremendous force so far as understanding the social and political reality is concerned, so far as revealing the truth is concerned. So, therefore, this Marxist perspective has basically has seen this entire thing with the help of class, with the help of mode of production and other categories which are central to their investigation. Now, along with Marxists, there is also the Gandhian tradition, and Gandhian tradition is a tradition which is quite popular so far as Indian political thought is concerned. Now, Gandhian tradition is based on the writings and ideas of Gandhi, and it is to be remembered that Gandhi was one person who neither rejected tradition completely nor accepted tradition fully, and therefore Ashish Nandy, one of the social psychologists, he calls Gandhi a critical traditionalist, that he subjected tradition to criticism. For example, he talked of Swadeshi and Swaraj, but that does not mean that Gandhi accepted everything which was Swadeshi. For example, he did not accept untouchability, which was a Swadeshi thing. He privileged Swaraj over Swadeshi to some extent. So, Gandhian thought of particularly based on the principle of non-violence, his truth and his understanding of religion is very significant here, that how he tried to articulate his ideas based on a closer association between politics and religion, because for him religion was not simply faith, but religion was also philosophy, ethics, science, because science has also come out of religion in the West, and there are there are number of scientific principles which at times come from the religious discourses. So, therefore, the four things which are part of religious discourse: ethics, philosophy, science and faith. Sometimes faith becomes over dominant, and that creates problem. So, therefore, Gandhi, while talking of close association with religion and politics, basically tries to look at this ethical and philosophical dimension of religion, and then he also tries to find out that how this ethics and philosophy, which have their roots in religion, can be of great use for imagining a better future for humanity, for building his utopia, or not only utopia for for the people of India, but also utopia, universal utopia of based on emancipation and justice. So, this Gandhian perspective is the next perspective which is quite significant. Now, there are two more perspectives which are at least quite one more perspective which is quite popular these days. A lot of people are trying to use this framework to see the Indian political thought, and that is called post-colonial. In fact, post-colonial signifies two different things. One thing is this the time frame in which some of the states got independence and became free, and they are also called post-colonial states. But here in political thought, this post-colonial symbolizes something else. Post-colonialism is a kind of category which has emerged in last 20 to 30 years, and they have tried to look at this entire imperialist discourse or the knowledge and the culture, and they try to see that how Indian political thought has certain features which have not been properly understood, and they are trying to use the new tools and techniques and to see that how the Indian political thought can be understood in a better way. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, sir. That formed for a very interesting lecture. Friends, we have gotten a number of perspectives in order to study the Indian political thought. So, with this we bring our lecture to a close, and thanks sir sincerely for being associated with us. Thanks a lot, sir, and thank you friends for watching. Have a great day.